Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse. Welcome back. Elon Musk is coming to town and he wants to cut the federal government by $2 trillion. He's recruited Vivek Ramaswamy for the job. Together, they formed the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. I haven't seen that level of excitement about cutting spending since pretty much ever. And I'm cheering them on. Whether they're going to be able to do it or not, it's another question, but we can only hope. And today, to talk about this, I have two wonderful guests. The first one is Tom Church. He is a policy fellow at the Hoover Institution, and he studies healthcare policy, entitlement reform, income inequality, poverty, and the federal budget. And his colleague, Danny Heil, is also a policy fellow at the Hoover Institution, and his focus is federal budget, tax policy, and federal anti-poverty programs. Welcome, guys.
Thank you, Vero.
Thanks for having us.
Okay. So before I start, I want you to give me, a little something. How did you guys end up being the budget nerds that you are? And you work, in similar fields. Do you have like similar path? So let's start with you, Danny. How did you end up where you are?
So, I began out of grad school kind of thinking that I'd be focusing on low income entitlement programs. I had a passion for those. Love to talk about the EITC. I was probably the only, 23-year-old that really was engaged in the EITC. But very quickly, just like Tom, we got involved in John Cogan's entitlement project. And John Cogan is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. And he has a great book, The High Cost of Good Intentions, which I know you know, Vero, very well.
I love that book.
It's an amazing book. And I spent, and Tom also spent, many years doing hardcore research all the way back to the Revolutionary War pensions, all the way to modern day entitlement policies. And through that, we sort of just happened to become experts on the budget. And so we are, I like to say I'm a budget nerd, but I like to focus on Social Security and healthcare policy because that's where all the money is. And so we've sort of just ended up there.
Yeah, I mean, I went to grad school, same place that Danny did 2 years later. He went up to the Hoover Institution. He did a pretty good job. They said, hey, we need another budget nerd. And I showed up. And, we're math and stats and econ guys. And we like working with big data. And it turns out if you throw yourself into big public use data sets and are pretty decent at stata and can pull numbers, a lot of people want to work with you. And so our career has just been looking at the numbers and trying to apply them and trying to find ways to save money. John Cogan was a wonderful resource to teach us the common pattern of government programs and spending. It's if listeners haven't read his book, please, The High Cost of Good Intentions, read it. It is insane how since the founding of our country, every spending program has the same pattern.
Yeah, and this pattern is pretty much you start small. And then you change eligibility, right? And you change eligibility, and then it grows and grows and grows. And I guess I would add another rule is that anything that is temporary becomes permanent very quickly. And then from being permanent, it also become like a mandate that the government is doing, and we cannot conceive it not being done, right? That's just
that's exactly right.
When he wrote in the book, he has it came out 5 years ago? Is that
more than that now? I think 6-7 years ago.
6 or 7 years ago.
Yeah.
So when I remember at the time, he had an example in there of the widow of a Civil War pensioner who was still to this day collecting the money, and I think kind of like she actually ended up dying shortly thereafter, not because of the book, but because she'd been around collecting those benefits for a long time. But it was just like it's a really wonderful book. So talking about this. You guys are budget nerds. You guys know where the money is. And where is it? I mean, where is the bulk of all that spending? First, let's say, give us a number about how much money we're spending or we'll be spending in 2025. And then where are we spending it?
I'll happy to jump in here. So 2025, we're going to be spending about $7 trillion. Now, you mentioned in your intro, Elon Musk wants to cut $2 trillion out of the budget. Well, $1 trillion of that is net interest. And so let's actually not even say that the denominator is $7 trillion. It's $6 trillion because we already have that debt. We're going to be paying that interest. I don't think we're taking a haircut, or the bondholders are taking a haircut on that. Most of the money is just in mandatory spending. The money is in Social Security and medical programs, in healthcare programs, in Medicare and Medicaid and the ACA. Discretionary spending, right? Defense and non-defense discretionary spending. It's only about, 30% of the budget, a third of the budget. The rest is mandatory, and now, unfortunately, net interest. I think it's fascinating that the biggest program is Social Security, the biggest outlays are Social Security, and then it's net interest on the budget. It's not even defense. It's not what people think it is, which is half the battle we have.
Can we explain quickly the difference between mandatory and discretionary for people?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, discretionary spending is what you think of what Congress has to vote on every single year when they pass a budget. So this is every October 1. We have a massive $2 trillion budget package. Hopefully, it's rarely actually October 1. It's typically, December. Like this year, they'll probably pass the budget sometime in the next few weeks, maybe. But the idea there is that Congress has to pass it every year. Mandatory spending, or what we generally refer to as entitlement spending, is sort of set on autopilot. The Congress has voted for this money at one point in time, and then they don't have to think about it on a regular basis. And typically, we think of entitlement spending, Social Security, Medicare, Tom has mentioned, but there are a number of smaller mandatory programs, and Congress loves mandatory programs because then they don't have to think about it, and it's something they can put on the back burner, and we can focus on, just on. But and then when you think of what discretionary spending really is, it's defense is half of it, and then the other half is all the things you think of when government is doing things rather than just writing checks. And so that's everything from Department of Homeland Security, FBI, to running all the little agencies that pop up around DC.
And I will note, Vero, and you must come across this all the time. When you say entitlement programs, one half of the responses of Americans is, it's not an entitlement program. I'm not entitled. I earned it. It's not like I'm getting a handout here. But we want to point out, entitlement programs just mean if you meet the criteria, you get this program. That's why the spending is on autopilot, hard to change. You have to change it through legislation. But if more and more people qualify, we will send those checks. We don't have to vote on that. That's just going to happen.
I would note people really need a dictionary. This is a pet peeve of mine when people say, well, it's not an entitlement because I earned it. I was like, that means you're entitled to it, is what you're saying?
So it's so funny because what I hear is actually, it is an entitlement because I earned it.
Yeah, right. That makes me feel better. I've heard the opposite.
So I mean, either way, it's not true. I like to say, well, actually, it is really not an entitlement. The moment Congress gets its act together, which maybe never, and changes the law, it doesn't matter how much you've paid into the system, right? Mm-hmm. And by the way, this paying into the system is not actually paying into your 401k. It's like paying for current 6 people and current retirees and it's really not.
And even beyond that, when you think of Medicare, 2/3 of Medicare isn't something that is funded by payroll taxes, right? So even particularly with Medicare, it's such a hard argument to make. And then, of course, the Social Security, come 2034, whenever, every dollar that you paid into Medicare or into Social Security will have gone out to someone in the form of Social Security benefits. So, regardless, we don't really draw a distinction between entitlement and discretionary spending too much outside of the fact that, we realize that policymakers aren't forced to think about entitlement spending. And since that's where so much of the money is, they need to start thinking more about it.
Vero, let me give you some last minute context here. 10-year, I'm looking at the CBO's 10-year estimates. Mandatory spending over 10 years, $51 trillion. Discretionary spending, $20 trillion. Net interest, $13 trillion. So, we're talking about $85 trillion over 10 years. So, hey, if we can cut $2 trillion from the budget, $20 trillion, that's not bad. But that's how much $22 trillion is how much we're expected to add to the federal debt over the next 10 years.
Yeah. So and by the way, also as part of entitlement spending, we also have interest on the debt, and you've mentioned this, and it used to be a small part of the budget. It used to be like $200 billion, which is not nothing, but in the grand scheme of things, it's actually pretty big. But it is now. It's like $1 trillion, and it's going up. And I've recorded a podcast with Josh Rao and Jack Salmon about what happens to actually interest on the debt and interest payment on the debt if the CBO is wrong about where interest rates are going. And there's just actually kind of the three of us had a kind of a gut feeling that there are just a lot of reasons to think that maybe the CBO is wrong. And these projections are really optimistic compared to what's going to happen. So that will come out after this podcast. But let's, by the way, a funny point. So I started working on budget issues in 2001. My first day at the Cato Institute was actually September 11th, 2001.
Wow.
But I didn't start immediately working on spending. I started like a few months later. And at the time, the federal budget, it was blowing my mind, was $1.8 trillion. And I always joke that I'm amazed I still have a job, considering that my job, like yours, has been to we come from a small government.
Right? Yeah.
We come from a small government perspective, and then now we're spending $7 trillion. And I mean, it's kind of like,
Several years ago, Tom and I put together a budget calculator for the Hoover Institution. It was called America Off Balance, and at the time, debt to GDP was about 70%. And so we said, let's be realistic. Let's create a game for people, and let's make the objective of the game just to keep debt to GDP below 100% of GDP. And we did this calculator in 2018, and then COVID showed up 2 years later, and we already lost 2 years in. So. It doesn't take much.
So we all agree we should be cutting spending, right? I mean, and so I actually think there's plenty to cut, even if you remove the $1 trillion in interest payment, and even if you look just at the $6 trillion, I think it's actually, it shouldn't be a big deal, leaving the politics aside, right? I mean, there's plenty to cut. But let's do what these guys are not doing. I'm afraid. Let's think about how the three of us would think about what needs to be cut, right? Like, what are the principles that would guide us? I'm kind of bothered by the word efficiency, because efficiency is a very loaded term. So how would you go about thinking first, just beginning, setting sets of principles? Where do we start?
I would say you start thinking the long term. A $2 trillion cut next year. We know, I know we've been asked to put politics aside, but let's stay in the realm of the possible to some extent and say $2 trillion isn't happening anytime soon, given the narrow majorities in Congress and given everything we've seen from Congress and the way even President Trump behaved in his first term. There isn't an appetite for huge spending cuts right away. But we know that particularly in entitlement spending, there's huge amounts of growth projected over the next 20, 30 years, and particularly with Social Security and Medicare, and also with low-income healthcare programs like Medicaid. And so I would say for policymakers, obviously it still takes a huge amount of just a political will to do these things. But if you begin with how are these programs growing and how can we limit the growth from this point forward. And so those are all the things we've talked about. Vero, these very well, right? It's price indexing Social Security benefits. It's figuring out ways to introduce more capitated payments into Medicare. It's figuring out ways to pass more of the responsibility of Medicaid over to the states. And these are things where you're not going to save money in the near term, because saving money in the near term would be incredibly disruptive. But over a 10-year, 20-year time period, you have really changed the budget and you have put us on a much more sustainable track record. And ultimately, that should be the goal, is we need to think long term of how do we keep debt from rising to what CBO is projecting at 150% of GDP by 2054.
So for Medicaid, you would like block grant.
I mean, I think, obviously that's the conservative answer is we block grant it, but I think there are reforms short of that. One is just FMAP reform, right? So FMAP is how the formula that determines how much the feds pay relative to the states. And that formula predates Medicaid by, 2 decades. This was done for the AFDC program back in like the 1940s or 1950s. And it's never really changed. Congress occasionally bumps it up or changes the amounts during recessions. But we're still wedded to this formula that's 78 years old, and the result is that these high income states like California and New York have actually pretty generous provisions. They get 50% of their Medicaid paid for by the government, and then more for people that are on through like the ACA. So there's opportunities short of full on block granting to save a lot of money in the long term.
Do the state decide the eligibility for Medicaid?
So there are certain the states have certain opportunities to expand the rolls, particularly for low income people who maybe are slightly above the thresholds. There's also just a question of the moral hazard that comes along with big matching payments. You are as a state a little less inclined to really cull the rolls and make sure that people are meeting the eligibility standards when the federal government's paying 70-80% of it. And we saw this particularly during COVID, that the federal government actually told states they weren't allowed to kick people off for a couple of years. And you had these states saying, well, this is great for us. We get all these extra folks on the program. We're not paying hardly anything on the dollar for it. Why not? And so, places like California are especially, huge Medicaid rolls. Something like 20% of the state is on Medicaid. And the state pays for some of it, but there's definitely a room where you can say let's make them pay more for it.
So you Danny would go after basically reforming and changing those programs. It may not have a short-term impact, but it changes basically the long-term trajectory.
The long-term growth rate. Yeah.
What about you, Tom?
Well, I mean, on this topic of Medicaid, there's also the Department of Government Efficiency, which AKA the GAO we already have. But there's reason to think that there are enormous improper payments in Medicaid. So if you want to focus still on Medicaid, pretty sure there's Paragon Institute and Brian Blaze's group has estimated maybe up to $20 billion a year in improper payments from people literally shouldn't be eligible, but are being covered. And then we're sending capitated payments to insurance companies. So there's that there. I want to back up a little bit because your question of what can you do to improve the budget picture is there's 4 parts, right? You can grow the economy faster. You can have more tax revenue. You can cut spending, and then you can do regulatory reform, which again leads to that economic growth. And so we'll focus on spending, and we're happy to talk about the rest of them. But you go after you go where the money is, right? It's if you're going to rob a bank, you go, that's why you go rob banks, because that's where the money is. And so there are big numbers out there, and they start to stack up. I mean, I've been looking at the federal budget pre-COVID and post-COVID, and it's insane how we just normalize this $2 trillion level jump. And then you start to go, okay, well, there must be just like one line in there. Like what is it that is just, that's up by 2 trillion? It's nothing. It's everything is just a level jump up for the most part. Social Security, not really, because that didn't, the number of people getting them didn't change.
Just to add to that, I mean, non-discretionary spending went up by 20% adjusted for inflation since 2019.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's definitely room to make cuts like that.
Right. So there's a bunch of $50 to $200 billion cuts to be found. One thing we'll focus
just by rolling back to 2019.
Yeah, if you were able to just say let's only have grown in discretionary spending by inflation since 2019, you save $200 billion a year.
Yeah, so we're talking about $2 trillion over 10 years is pretty good. Again, our goal is maybe $20 trillion over 10 years, so you got to start stacking them. So,
well, that's their goal. Yeah,
that's their goal. That is their goal.
A bit more realistic.
We can go through these programs. The ACA, temporary expanded subsidies. It's funny because it's not really in the budget. They're supposed to expire at the end of 2025, but CBO and JCT said, hey, if you make those permanent over 10 years, the net cost is $335 billion. These are subsidies for primarily for high income earners, above 400% of poverty. We're giving ACA subsidies too. It's not that much. It does also lower the cost sharing for people below that, but $335 billion is not small amount of money over 10 years. The Inflation Reduction Act was originally scored to be deficit reducing. And 2 short years later, it's what? We're up to
$1 trillion. It's going to be $1 trillion over 10 years.
Yeah, $1 trillion over 10 years. And a lot of that is due to unlimited subsidies on green energy tech. And you know what? I'm very glad that I'm seeing many, many states embracing nuclear power again as a form of renewable, solid, long-term investments in energy. And so I don't, do we need to get rid of all of it? We could,
yes.
frankly.
Yes.
I think
Yes.
we could.
Yes, Thomas.
Yes. Because they should do it independent. They would do it independently
Agreed.
of the
Amazon, Nvidia, Microsoft, they're all making, they're all looking for nuclear power. So yeah, let the private sector do it. So, I mean, there's a lot of money right there. We can keep going. You asked about a philosophy. Here's something that we like to joke about is that, the old line is Democrats want to increase benefits for the poor. Republicans want to cut taxes for the rich. At this point, we need to cut benefits for the rich. Danny and John Kogan have done great work on how well, especially seniors are doing right now. But America's gotten pretty wealthy. And if you look at where we're spending money, the distributional impact of truly where all of this money is going, an astonishing amount is going to people who are doing very, very well. And that's probably not what we should be giving money to.
Preach, brother, preach. My solution that will never see the light of day. Like Nick Gillespie and I think it was in 2013 or 2012 or something like this. We wrote a piece for Reason, a long feature piece about the generational warfare. And ever since I've said in my ideal vision of the world, we wouldn't have any age-based program because seniors are overrepresented in the top income quintile. And while in 1935 and later when Social Security and these programs were created and expanded, it may have made sense that for people who stopped working, they were poor. There was no capital market like we have today, and basically the wealth that has exploded thanks to the capital markets, thanks to the market economy is just enormous. And now we have these programs that are effectively enormous transfer of wealth from the relatively young and poor to the relatively old and rich. And it doesn't mean that everyone who is old is rich, but it's certainly, as a group, it makes no sense to have age be a criteria. So I would means test the hell out of everything. Now, Medicare is more difficult because I would get rid of Medicare and just have Medicaid. I would just and reform Medicaid because there's a lot of problem there. That will never happen. Will never happen.
You aren't invited to the AARP meetings, are you, anymore? Yeah.
Well, so interesting enough, once I was on a panel making that case with an AARP representative, and he said that there was some soundness to what I was saying, and I was like, "Go me!"
He was out of a job the next day.
Go me! But so it's interesting. I like the way you guys are thinking about this. I think about it slightly differently, right? I think, okay, if the goal, if we're going to be calling efficiency, putting the country on a sustainable budget path, you guys are 100% correct. And that's there's just no question about it. The drivers of our future debt and the driver of our current debt, right, is just there are these so-called entitlement program, and they're Social Security and Medicare in particular, right? So that's just, anyone who is actually really serious about fiscal sustainability and says we don't want to do anything about Social Security and Medicare is just simply not serious. But I also kind of think about this in terms of, I like small government, but I also like to think, as a good libertarian, what is the federal government's role? And the federal government's role is certainly not a lot of what it's doing. And I think, for instance, there's a ton I would love to see, right? A commission that looks at cutting all the stuff that the federal government does, but are purely state and local function. And And in a way, kind of like there's some of the Medicaid that falls into this, certainly, things like FEMA, transportation, education, like there's so much there. If you just use this. And then of course, and we go to the nuclear subsidies part, is like, I would like to see people really thinking along the lines, should the federal government really be in charge of subsidizing the private sector? My answer is no, like no exception, no, cut it all, right? So that's kind of how, I would think about it. There's like, on one hand, there's like, yeah, all that stuff, subsidies, and as infuriating as it is, it doesn't matter if the goal is a long-term fiscal future of the US. But I would love, if we're talking about efficiency and if we're talking about to think about all the stuff that the federal government is doing and it really shouldn't be doing.
Well, so you're talking about progress. I mean, this is progress studies. This is the upwing from James Pethokoukis, right? And Danny doesn't love this phrase, the abundance. It's abundance. And how do you get it? Well, the government is standing in the way of things. Danny doesn't love this phrase, but I like it. Make progress by letting people do things. So we're looking at these energy subsidies. And why are we giving all these energy subsidies? It's because we have NEPA standing in the way. It's all this regulatory and permitting reform. Why aren't companies doing it more themselves? Is because the government is telling them they can't, or they're making it much more expensive. So we do this thing where we restrict the supply by not allowing it to happen and then subsidizing the demand, as opposed to just getting out of the way. So when you say, the government shouldn't subsidize the private sector, what would we like to see? DOGE should come out and say, hey, let's take NEPA, the Environmental Protection Act, which has led to, it's just spawned CEQA in California and just this enormous regulatory burden for all the energy permitting, for example. Let's start over. Let's scrap it and start over, because that is standing in the way of so much of what we want to do. And by the way, we've made it sound like the green energy subsidies from the Inflation Reduction Act were nuclear related. No, we're mostly talking
green energy,
solar and wind and the rest of it there. That's the bulk of all of that. But if we just get out of the way, these companies will be able to do it faster because they need it, they want it.
I disagree.
Okay.
I agree with the part about let's the government out of the way and the utter destruction to growth and to progress created by government permitting and government intervention and government regulation. There's no debate from me. But the incentives within government means that politicians just can't freaking help themselves.
Agreed.
And they're going to be distributing subsidies, whether it's efficient on the ground to do it or not. And this is why I kind of have no compulsion to cutting the hell out of it and just say, as a rule, we should not give anything, no government granted privilege to the private sector. That means no bailouts, no subsidies to green, brown, whatever color energy you have, no tax credits to this or that. No, I'm a radical this way, and of course, as everything, the problem with my vision is that it goes against all the incentives in government. Politicians, they hear the voices of those who wants benefits, who wants like, give me this, I really need this, I'm a small business. And it's just like, it would be so much better if you gave me a lower rate on that small business loan. And if I got better term and like I'm Boeing, and you know what would be great is if you gave an export subsidies to those people who want to buy my plane, and they can buy my plane, but it wouldn't it be so nice if they could buy it at a discounted rate, blah, 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 blah. That's how it works. And of course, the unseen victims of all of these subsidies, they don't line up to say, because most of us don't even know, right? But anyway, that's it's in that sense that I entirely agree with you. But it's I just think that unfortunately, even if we had the best regulatory regime, I think we'd see much less of it, much less demand for it. But politicians just can't help themselves.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. And I think one thing, Tom and I have spent a lot of time, especially working with John Kogan, on just looking through the history. And we ask ourselves, like, at what point in history do you actually see, some of these things stopping? It's the incentives are always there, right? And, pretty much ever since we've moved from the Madisonian to the Hamilton, version of government spending, we've lost just across the board But we do know there are a few points in time where you actually do see progress on these things. And we have, Tom and I, our little podcast, 584 Vetoes, is named after the number of vetoes that Grover Cleveland had, right? And Grover Cleveland stands as an example as someone who like actually looked at what Congress is passing and saying, no, these aren't for, any sort of national cause. Like this isn't within the constitutional bounds, and vetoed them. And then you go and you ask where else in history this happened. And it's almost always with executive leadership. It's FDR actually saying to the bonus folks in 1932 that no, you're not getting your benefits, right? Or 1933. It's Reagan in 1980, 1981, actually saying, yeah, this is what we want to do and we're going to do it. It's Clinton a little bit with welfare reform, right? That actually after he got, the 94 Congress came in, he changed his tune and actually was willing to push for some substantive retrenchment of these programs. And so, I would say this is one of my problems with the Department of Government Efficiency is it takes Donald Trump. Donald Trump actually has to be motivated to do these changes. And on the margin, of course, we're not going to go back to a Madisonian budget as much as I would like that, as much as you would like that, Vero.
Me too, by the way. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yes. Tom's the only one that doesn't live within the Beltway. So it's funny that he's the one that is a squishy with these things. But no, I think that's where, if we want to see spending reform, and it has to come from the top. And unfortunately, I think this is where the skepticism comes in, is I don't see much of an appetite for that. And the other thing I would mention is all those examples happened pretty quickly. I mean, outside of Clinton's welfare reform, they hit the ground running. I big fan of going back to 1981 and looking at what Dave Stockman did as OMB director. And by the time they were in office, they already had a list of reforms that they wanted to go after, how they were going to cut back on DI, how they were going to fix all the litany of entitlement programs that had just ballooned during Nixon and Carter. And I don't see that here. And I think that's where, if there was a serious effort to cut spending, we'd already be like, yeah, this is the presidential agenda within the next 6 months. And I don't see an appetite for that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I'm really interested in what you just said, because it's, in a way, it goes reverse to the reason why I'm skeptical that we're going to see things happening. My skepticism comes from the fact that, Musk and Ramaswamy may come with the best list of spending cuts. They may even have good Medicare and Medicaid reforms. Let's even dream big, right? And unfortunately, if we don't get Congress, it still has to go through Congress. But you're saying something different. You're saying actually, ultimately, the drive has to come from the executive. And so is it the executive convincing Congress that they have to do this? Is that what it is?
I think so to some extent, right? I think when you think of what Congress looks like, I mean, obviously it's having executive leadership, I would say, is a necessary but insufficient condition, right? You need Congress to sign on to these things. But ultimately, the examples of successful retrenchment have always began with the executive saying, I am going to go and use my political capital to push for these changes. And you're not going to get everything, right? Congress loves their special projects. But, I think, when you go back to things like successful efforts like the BRAC, right? A small example, right? The base realignment, back in the 80s and 90s. This was Congress knowing that they weren't going to be able to, actually make these cuts because there's just the incentives didn't line up. And so we're going to task this outside group with doing it. And Congress, the congressional incentives are just so backwards, right? They all have an incentive to spend more than what we can spend. And this is why you end up with massive pork barrel spending every year, because that's how the incentives are aligned. So I would say it's up to the president to say, yes, I'm willing to hold the line on the budget, and I'm willing to say, use my political capital for that. And, I'm skeptical that this president is willing to do so. But I think ultimately when we get these fixes, it's going to have to come from top-down leadership.
It also helps to be in some sort of fiscal emergency. If you go back to when we've actually cut benefits and done these things, you can think of Social Security reform, the Greenspan Commission. The program ran out of money, and so you could actually raise the taxes. You could actually raise the retirement age starting in 25 years and do that. The bonus marchers from World War I, the World War I pensioners. We were in the the Great Depression, and so they had to find. They couldn't just keep ratcheting up spending as much. And so I don't know that, we're in an emergency. You and I think it's an emergency because it's so much money that we're spending, but it's not like we're in a huge recession. We're growing enormously. Unemployment's low. Inflation is, it's not 8%, 9% anymore. The real thing, Vero, is how will we know? The Department of Government Efficiency is supposed to give recommendations in 18 months or so. No. The presidential budget will come out maybe March. Congress will then take its, Congress hopefully will say, well, appreciate it. We'll do our own things. That's when we'll know if there's executive leadership on these things. I want to point out, if the number comes out and the deficit is supposed to reduce, but spending goes up, well, that's not a win for us. That's still bigger government. So I think we'll find out. And Donald Trump has never been interested in Social Security or Medicare reform. Doesn't look like he wants to fight unions too much. I'm skeptical that we're going to have that executive leadership push, even though there's all this appetite now or talking about actually cutting this program.
Even the timing of when the Department of Government Efficiency says they're going to wrap up and have this, all these recommendations by the summer of 2026. So going into a congressional election, you're going to have a big list of spending cuts. What congressman's going to go back in August of that year to their constituents and be like, oh yeah, I'm fully on board with everything Musk has said. We're going to cut 80% from, these agencies, and we're going to do this, and that. That's where they lose me. But I think more than anything, I would say, the 18 months time is it's ridiculous. We know where the spending is. We know where the money is.
Exactly.
We have a long list of reforms that Cato has talked about over the years. We've talked about over the years. There's nothing here that's that hard to analyze. What's hard is the politics.
Yeah. And you're right. It's not as if we haven't all of us kind of basically spent the last whatever amount of time we've worked pushing for stuff to cut. On Friday, I put out a list of stuff I'd like to see cut, but it was like, I had to stop myself because I could have listed like 30 more that I've worked on, in my career from they're not realistic in a lot of, like I said, pretty much everything I do, but it's not the lack of ideas. And also we have experience, right, with commissions like this one that didn't work so well. So the Grace Commission, then there was the PART thing during, was it Bush? Bush was PART.
Was it? I think so.
It was also about kind of like efficiency, and the Grace Commission the Grace Commission to me is interesting because it was in the 80s and I can't remember the name. The name of the guy was Grace, but I can't remember what his first name was. They came up with a long list of like maybe $1 trillion of cuts. And what's interesting is that the only ones that actually went through were the ones that could be done through the executive branch. Basically nothing worked and went through Congress. And you talked about David Stockman. The Tree from Politics is one of my favorite books. That's why I went after the SBA. That's why I went after the Export-Import Bank.
Love it.
Literally, this is like where I'd be like, what am I going to go after next? And I'll pick up the Tree from Politics. And I was like, oh, okay. It's the whole thing where Stockman was so frustrated because he said we came in with these big ideas about making the government better, cutting stuff, shrinking the size of government, but along lines that actually made sense. It wasn't just retaliation and favor your friends. Like I'm afraid we're going to see a lot with this administration, and effectively he left because he was so unhappy because it wasn't happening, right? And so,
and you can see when he left too. If you look at the budget, it's like you get we call it
the Stockman plateau.
I call it the Kogan plateau because John Kogan was actually
there.
deputy.
So please tell me about this because I don't actually know about that.
No. So it's the Stockman plateau is definitely actually what it is. But it's they actually held the line on spending for 4 or 5 years, and then Stockman left, and 85 it just shoots right back up. Right, that it was first term Reagan administration was literally the only example you could see of the actual successful retrenchment across the board. And it was very short-lived.
And I will say the retrenchment, we talked about mandatory and discretionary spending, and it's not like it was 50-50. What really ends up happening in these things is because entitlement spending is so hard to cut, you mostly cut from discretionary. So now discretionary spending is 30%. I mean, I would say that if we're going to get any spending cuts, I would be surprised if it was only 2/3 came from discretionary and 1/3 came from mandatory, even though to really save money, you'd want to flip
it. Yeah. And I think that's the last 10 years, right? In 2012, they had the Budget Control Act, which was this noble idea to really contain the budget. And we were going to have this entitlement reform attached to it. And sort of as a penalty to make sure that lawmakers were willing to sign on to something, they said, we're going to have these massive cuts to discretionary spending if you can't agree to some entitlement reforms. And then we just had the massive cuts to entitlement spending that only lasted for 2-3 years. And then Congress waived those, every year. So that's why I think, the focus on the long term, we know there's no political appetite to do something in the short term. And ultimately, if you get your big discretionary caps, which are good things, we know that those are short-lived. We know that does very little to rest the long-term the growth in the federal budget. So,
and it was the same. It was the same in the 80s, right? Like they put the why am I blanking now? The Graham Rodman. With the sequestration, it was like we're gonna do if we exceed a certain amount, we're gonna cut basically sequester spending, and then it was like, oh yeah, but you know what, we can't do it for Social Security. Oh wait, we can't do it for defense. Oh wait, and then in the end, basically the big cuts apply to just a very small part of the budget, making it just politically non-viable, and that's
exactly.
It's they always do this. It's
and we still have some of these rules in place, right? We have annual pay-go rules that Congress just annually waives. I haven't looked it up recently, but the last 2 years, there's something like $2 trillion in pay-go that they're just every year they're like, well, we're obviously not doing that. We can't do that, right? But it's these huge numbers.
Well, so if you're interested, Eric Leeper wrote a paper for us about the COVID inflation, right? He's like a fiscal theory of the price level guy, even though he doesn't like this name. And he it's interesting because he has a table in there, and I hadn't thought about this in a long time, where he actually looks at the increase in spending during COVID, and he shows basically the part that was first subjected in theory to pay-go and the what ended up being subjected to pay-go, which was literally, and this feeds right about the fact that kind of when you spend your time signaling that you're just not serious about the debt, and in the end, that's where the inflation comes, because at some point investors are looking at all this primary deficits and they're saying, wait a minute, what am I going to be paid back with? What kind of, and they're assumed that basically the Federal Reserve is going to kind of
monetize it,
eventually monetize it, and then inflation comes in now. So and this is actually what happened with COVID. I mean, in fact, a lot of the COVID spending has been paid on the back of bondholders, right? And so it's this is why I actually think that when people think that interest rates are going to go back down, just because the Fed is cutting, I'm like, right. Those guys been burnt in the same way as they were burnt in the 80s, and they're probably going to hold on to their higher interest rates.
You would hope so.
But what it means, obviously, is that the consequence for interest payment on the debt is just going to be long lasting.
Huge, and the reduced amount of fiscal flexibility that comes with that. If you're a lawmaker and you're talking about right now, it's 16% of the budget. If it's 20-30% of the budget is just interest spending, right? That really reduces your opportunities if you have, a conflict in Asia that requires more defense spending. These are things where we're putting huge costs on next generation.
The next recession, Danny, there's going to be a call for $2 trillion in stimulus payments again.
No, it's got to be $4 trillion. We did $1 trillion for 2009, $2 trillion for actually more than that, $5 trillion. It's got to be like $10 trillion, right?
I was going to say. I was like, what is this $2 trillion, $4 trillion?
That's so cute.
You guys are
so cute. Yeah.
I mean, it's just like a month. Yeah, a month.
Exactly.
I can see.
There we go.
I can see that.
Yeah.
But so let's talk about actually inflation, because I saw a tweet yesterday by Elon Musk. He was retweeting a guy who I can't remember who it was, that showed spending per capita going up just a dramatic amount between the 80s and now. And he retweeted, he retweeted something, and this is why we have inflation, which obviously I was thinking, John Cochran's head must be blowing up.
I would
but,
imagine so, yeah.
my head was, and I was thinking, I don't know, like I probably shouldn't say anything, because the problem, right, is that they have one sentence and then our explanation is like, it's like 10 paragraphs. So anyway, let's talk about this, because what happens, right? We know that probably nothing is going to happen on the spending front in the next year or two, right? And I am just not convinced that we're done with inflation. First, interest payment on the debt, required to make space in the budget actually to pay for those interest payment, right? We should, in theory, for inflation, really, in fact, I've learned this from John Cochran and Eric Lieber, is that Volcker alone didn't do it. There was actually a fair amount of fiscal adjustment, if only through the Social Security Commission in 1983. In the 1980s, there was a lot of growth. There was a lot of deregulation. There was just a lot of the things. And now, So what happens if inflation goes back up? Does this change? Do you think that changes basically the discussion we're going to have?
I would hope so. I think, you're looking at the option just gets so much worse if inflation's higher, in part because so much of the federal budget's linked to inflation, right? So, it used to be inflation, could actually help you a little bit because, you deflate a bunch of the, your Social Security benefits wouldn't rise by inflation prior to 72, but everything's linked to inflation now, right? So just as a matter of what happens to primary deficits and if inflation rises, like it's going to rise by the same amount, right? So the problem gets bigger. And I'm I think even more concerned than most because, you look at what Trump has talked about as his big initiatives, right? It's tariffs. Okay, well, that's, something that we should be definitely concerned about causing inflation or at least, increases in prices. So from the consumer standpoint, you can say tariffs are going to drive up prices. There's going to be definitely a push that, you're going to have this, whoever the next Fed appointment is, right? You're talking about, Trump has said that, maybe he'll nominate someone ahead of time as sort of a shadow FOMC. And you're like, well, that's, is that person going to be out there saying, oh, no, they should keep rates higher? No, right? They're going to say, oh, let's push rates down. So I worry that the Fed is going to feel, a political push to actually go to be, actually a little bit too loose. Throw in tariffs, throw in a big tax cut that's largely not about, supply side improving efficiency in society, but really just giveaways for, children and things like that.
And it drives up primary deficits.
Exactly. Yeah. So, you're talking about deficits are likely to be higher this next year if they get their tax, or in the next couple of years, if they get the tax cuts as just fully extended. Fed might be looser just to play the political game, and we'll have tariffs. That's a recipe for higher prices.
So it's literally the reverse of. It's the reverse of. There's some of the
80s, right?
There's some of the tax cuts that will be really pro-growth. At the very least, it would really be anti-growth to let them expire. Like I guess
I hope so. Although I feel like they might sacrifice full expensing to get a bigger child tax credit or something ridiculous.
Exactly.
Like
no,
that, right?
I agree. Yeah. So, but the full expensing to me would be, I assume, pro-growth, but there's all those tax credits and stuff. It's like, and of course, no tax on tips and this is
get rid of SALT, right?
This is which is the pay for. All of this is just the reverse of. But what about Tom? What do you think?
You're talking about what worked well was in the 80s. You had a Fed governor who would actually held the line and kept rates high to push inflation down, and then also fiscal reform. I think, if we were a couple decades ago, we would have just focused on the monetary side. What don't you want? You don't want Arthur Burns running the Fed. You don't want easy money because the president says we need to win elections and prices are too high, and so pump the money, bring the interest rates lower and help people out. Combined with more and more spending, which just leads to more and more inflation. It's been a lucky thing for Danny and myself to work at Hoover because I could literally just go ask John Taylor for years, how does monetary policy work? What's happening? What's going to happen? And then combined now with John Cochran, who's written The Fiscal Theory of the Price Level to point out, hey, it's not just the monetary policy side that affects inflation. If there's an ensuing fiscal response, which, one and the other drive each other a little bit, and what you really end up seeing is both happening at the same time, That's what leads to inflation. So how do you bring down inflation? You need to get your budget under control, and you need to hold the line for the Fed, and the Fed chair needs to be independent.
And by the way, Lieber has shown me many times in that Volcker understood the connection between the monetary and the fiscal side. And it doesn't mean what Musk was implying, that any deficits brings inflation,
Right.
but he understood that actually there is a very potent connection, and that's happened through expectations, right? It's like, again, these investors are looking at these primary deficits and they're like, what kind of money am I going to be paid back with? And especially because one of the things we haven't talked about is just how short-term our debt is. And all of these effects really take place really quickly. So in the time that we have, I want you guys to dream big. So I'm going to start with you, Danny. So let's say you're sitting, you have like 3 hours. I say three, just with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, two really smart guys, and you get to convince them of one thing to do. Tom, I'm going to you, Tom, next. What do you?
I mean, and they have the power to enact these things, or at least push
yeah.
Let's
dream. We're dreaming.
Okay,
we're like
there
we're in a world where that doesn't exist, where politics,
Yeah, I mean, this isn't going to surprise you, Vero, but it's, go after every upper income entitlement program, right? Or every formula that benefits a high income senior. As Tom had said, we've done a lot of research the last couple of years on just looking at how well seniors are doing. And my favorite little tax statistic that I think actually would impress these guys is, back in the early 1990s, if you look at tax returns, about 10% of all Social Security benefits went to the top 20% of tax returns. Now it's 20%.
Exactly.
Now, 1 in 5 Social Security dollars go to the top 20% taxpayers, not the top 20% of seniors, top 20% taxpayers. That is an unsustainable system. And if I were to describe Social Security to anyone that didn't know about the program, and I said, we have this program that gives the biggest benefits to wealthy and high income seniors, and it's paid for by low and middle income workers. Are you for that program? To a T, nobody would say yes. Oh, that is the right program to have. And yet here we are. And then I would say, you do things like that with Medicare too.
Man, I love you guys.
Mm-hmm.
You're like, finally, my people.
I told my wife yesterday I'd be preaching to the choir. So, yeah.
Well, but you know what? I think people don't know this, though. People just don't understand. So that's the case you would make to them, right? And you would make it this way, saying, this
I guess
is
the
just
underline
not right.
is means test. And you do have to convince the public of that. I mean, people are against cuts to Medicare or Medicaid, to any of these programs that people think go to low-income people, because they think if you cut them, people will fall through the cracks and we won't cover the people who need it most. And so you need to pair this with, we are going to take benefits away from people who don't need them. If we want to talk Medicare, premiums are really, really cheap. Medicare premiums are cheap relative to what is being covered and compared to the private sector, compared to working age population. I think income-based premiums should probably go up in the long run. If we could wave a magic wand, we would put Medicare and Social Security on sound financial footing and then say you're not allowed to touch these for the next 75 years.
Can I ask a really kind of stupid, probably libertarian question? I'm always kind of like, okay, leaving aside what the government should do and not do and all this, one of the things you would think the government is there for is to kind of redistribute money from those who have it to those who don't, right? I'm just saying, like, that's one of the things people say. I'm not saying this is what. Then I kind of like, doesn't it defy the purpose of that saying to actually have stuff that you still have to pay for to get it? Now, you see what I mean? It's just like, if you're going to be paying a premium to get Medicaid, shouldn't we just like go to the private sector? I mean, I wasn't thinking about it until you said it. And I'm kind of like, I'm going to ask it, even if I sound like an idiot, because I'm kind of always like, it's just bizarre to me.
Yeah.
Like,
and I think this is a good call that when you think of, when we look at Medicare, we're, as budget folks, we focus on the outlays, right? We focus on what is the actual line item for the government. But when you throw in premiums, the government controls so much more of our healthcare spending because they take 25% of Medicare premium or expenditures come from premiums. And so they're spending a huge amounts more that we don't really have a choice over. If you're on Part B, you got to pay your premiums, and you don't really have a choice on that front. And that's where premium support models, which are long been sort of what Republicans have said is the answer to Medicare. And that's really, we'll give you a voucher to go out and buy private health insurance. And then you're kind of cutting that system out a little bit, and you're giving people more choice and opportunity to kind of figure out what they want. And if you want a cheaper plan as a senior and you don't want those high premiums, like, you have the opportunity to do so. But yeah, we're right there with you on the amount of just cross subsidies that go along that don't make any sense outside of, maybe for the political, right? This is the FDR, once they start paying into the system, then, they're there forever. You're never going to get rid of it. And I think, to some extent, there's some good politics with these programs, even though they're terrible, terrible economics and philosophically.
So do you guys want to know what my dream would be?
Please.
So my dream is this. First, he talks to Danny for 3 hours. Then snack, talk to Tom for 3 hours. Good night of sleep. And then I come in for 3 hours and I convince them that since you've convinced them of the big stuff, that they need to cut all subsidies to the private sector. That means, and I just like no export-import bank, no SBA, no all of that stuff, but also not of the, like, all the tax expenditures that are meant as their special interest politics. That's my dream.
There's a lot of money there. There's a lot of money in the small programs. There's a lot. I mean, it's not going to put us on a different, but you guys have taken care of the long-term path of the US. So I don't have to do it. I can just do the fun stuff. And hopefully like the next person will be someone who, like Chris Edwards at Cato, for instance. He would convince them that all this aid in grants to the states, and then here we go, and we're the leaner, meaner country, country on earth, and we're going to be. This is how you get 4% growth every year. Come on.
Yes, exactly. And of course, then the next meeting is with Casey Mulligan, who tell them all the regulatory reform. And by the way, I actually think probably we start with Casey Mulligan.
I think that's right.
We start with the regulatory reform stuff. Then we go to Danny, then Tom, then me, then Chris. That's my dream.
And I think, to some extent, the reg reform was definitely the biggest success in the first Trump administration, right? It was that and the tax plan. And I love, the growth focus on it, and we should definitely do more of that. I'm always a little concerned when we get too much into the growth side of things, as I was Jeb Bush's economic policy guy, so I know way too much about 4% economic growth. But I do get concerned that we kind of treat it as this free lunch for politicians, that you can outgrow these problems. And
we can't.
Right. And it's worth emphasizing that, particularly with Social Security, Medicare, these things grow right along with GDP. So let's get the reg reform, let's grow the economy, and then let's solve these programs in the long term.
Well, these are wonderful last words. Thank you, guys. This was so fun. I could do this for another 10 hours. So thank you again. And I can't wait to listen to your podcast and to continue reading you guys.
Yeah. Thanks, Vero.
Really appreciate it, Vero. This was a lot of fun.